I have always wondered standing afar what on earth this giant tree stump was. What did it really look like outside of the dark, deep-root depths? Was it the base of the Erdtree? Did it extend all the way up? If it was, why did it not shine with radiance like the Erdtree itself? What about the tree Godwin was imbued in? Was that the Erdtree? Or perhaps this giant seemingly severed stump on the world map represented something else entirely. Perhaps this reference to a Greattree on several items offered a hint. Now, after years of wondering, I have the means to check. Rising above, we see a flurry of roots and what appear to be straight, solid tree stumps. While all of them are in their own right huge, as I fly backward, the full scope of this immense, imposing figure really starts to take shape. But it isn't until we break through the crust of the underground that we see it in all of its colossal glory. Towering above everything else, unmatched in its girth and stature, this titan, wrapped by intertwining vines seemingly keeping it stable, stands peerless. This is what I believe to be one of the two Greattrees, and a part of what is referred to as the One Great. The community is absolutely rife with debate about the existence of what is referred to as the Greattree, with the naysayers suggesting it is a translation issue, as Erdtree and Greattree share the same Japanese kanji, while those in favor of its existence more often than not point to the root resin item description, which specifically and distinctly references the Greattree, among several other items. I, however, am entirely convinced of the existence of the Greattree, predecessor to the Erdtree, and I believe I have ample evidence. But this goes far beyond the stump I just showed you. There is so much more to it, and the implications are vast. I spent the last month examining tree iconography throughout the game, discovering depictions of Greattrees that existed before the time of the Erdtree. I've gone to every castle, notable building, and every fort, as well as examined statues, weaponry, and armor to look for the tree symbolism used and compare them. This was a side quest on my information gathering for my next video on the grandmother, but the things I found regarding trees warranted a video of its own, and like always, this little Alice found herself free-falling down a rabbit hole. And we will get into the many things I have discovered. However, quickly before I even move into the nuance of these depictions of trees and the many mysteries that they hold, I want to quickly address the translation issue with a question. If all of the references to a Greattree are simply referencing the Erdtree based on the Japanese kanji, then why in all of the patches Elden Ring has undergone have critical pieces of information about arguably the most important icon in the game, the ever-present Erdtree, in foundational context and on important items nonetheless, be left untouched? There is not a single instance of any item or anything referred to as the Greattree ever being patched to Erdtree. On the contrary, there have been several additions specifically of the word Greattree into items in subsequent patches, such as the root resin, which reads, "Resin secreted from the roots of the Greattree can also be found near trees on the surface. The roots of the Greattree were once linked to those of the Erdtree, or so they say, and it is for this reason catacombs are built around Greattree roots." This is doubling down on what is an already pretty compelling description in favor of the Greattree's existence. Just like the description of Deathroot, which had no reference to the word Greattree and had it specifically added. Not Erdtree, or as my friend Garrulous pointed out to me, the map of the Deeproot Depths, which also had the word Greattree added to its description later on. These examples aside, I honestly don't think either perspectives are technically wrong. The Greattree is a separate thing, or was, and the Erdtree is of the Greattree, or rather, part of it, akin to the way a graft is a part of what it is grafted to. If you have someone else's arm attached to you, or an organ after a transplant, it is then your arm. No? I will of course be expanding upon this. With that said, if the Erdtree was the first, then what are these depictions of a Greattree on the obelisks in Siofra River, or in the Mogwin Dynasty Mausoleum, hidden behind this mysterious structure, or on the tablet of this figure, or these tall straight trees and these small bending ones, or this depiction of a tree with life bursting forth in Farum Azula, or between these two beasts, or this one on the graves of the Beastmen, all predating the time of the Erdtree. I believe these depictions of Greattrees tell a story. They are vital elements of the timeline of Elden Ring and the lands between, and today we're going to explore them all, and possibly expose the identity of the fell god and nature of the original sin along the way. We have many depictions of Greattrees throughout the game before the time of the Erdtree. Beyond that, we even have physical Greattrees separate to the Erdtree, so the concept of a Greattree equal to or rivaling that which we know as the Erdtree is hardly a foreign one. But which one was first? Which is the original tree? What was there before the one tree to rule them all? Throughout the lands between, we see an abundance of tree iconography and symbolism, and we even find some in the lands of shadow. Some of these icons are clearly the same depictions or very similar, with small changes detailing the passage of time, while others are entirely different. They are also, of course, seldom in isolation to other symbols and patterns, which all help us to narrow down the timeline or associations. Once you finally figure out which ones were there first and which ones were put over them and why, these icons tell us a very important story and reveal the timeline. A timeline of the one great, which was operated by two Greattrees. A lot of research went into this. Naturally, there'll be quite a bit of information, so bear with me and buckle up. This is one hell of a tumble, Ellis, and we are most certainly not in Kansas anymore. Before I jump into the thick of the tale between two trees before the Erdtree, it's only right that I explore the Erdtree itself first. If we follow what I have referred to as the stump, or perhaps carcass of the Greattree from the deep root depths nestled close by the nameless eternal city, we notice 6 intertwining vines or roots wrapped around it. Though only 5 are visible at its apex, if we go inside of the stump, we can clearly see the 6 accompanying roots or vines. Remember this imagery for a little later. The color is consistently dark brown, and if we move closer, we can see the many hues that comprise it. But as we reach the top, just as the map seems to insinuate, what we see here is a stump, while there is no shining Erdtree present, or even a hint of gold coming from this tree. It is very possible, and I would argue even likely, that this is meant to continue and be what we see above ground as the Erdtree. But there's more to it than that. As we follow the Erdtree to its apex, we notice some pretty strange things along the way. First, at the crevice into its hollow interiors, we notice what almost appears to be an inner crust of not glowing gold tree, but something more akin to the stump or carcass of the deep root depths. This demonstrates a distinct difference in color, texture, and position, which heavily insinuates, in my opinion, 2 separate entities. This separate brown section dons a carving on it, which I will note on eventually, and as we continue upward, the outer crust of gold gives way again, a seemingly patchwork of gold plating engulfing the Greattree. Suddenly, we are again greeted with the similar brown of the deep root depths, and the branches seemingly so very akin to the vines crawling up the Greattree, splayed, with gorgeous white elven-esque vine patterns all over them. I believe this is the carcass of one of the 2 Greattrees, the continuation of what we saw in the deep root depths. And what we see engulfing it and growing from within it, springing from within its hollow boughs and brilliant brown branches glowing a sickly radiant gold, is the Erdtree. I believe its existence as something separate to this carcass of the Greattree is reinforced again by the fact that the glowing branches of the Erdtree disappear when you light the tree on fire, whereas the carcass of the Greattree it grew from within remains. Almost as though the golden branches sprouting from the carcass are in fact illusory, as described by its very seeds. The gold seeds found by these golden homages to the Erdtree. A golden seed, found at the base of an illusory tree. When the Elden Ring was shattered, these seeds flew from the Erdtree, scattering across the various lands, as if life itself knew that its end had come. So how did this happen? What transitioned this Greattree to the Erdtree that we know today? Hell, what even is the Erdtree? Well, to quickly revise the concept, as I have explored it many times in previous videos, from the many descriptions and depictions of the Erdtree, we can get a good idea of what it is and how it functions. It is known that souls are reintroduced to the Erdtree via the Greattree network, and are seemingly redistributed via the Greattree or Erdtree as well. The Elden Beast, which is the Elden Ring, is housed within the Erdtree. The souls that are processed through the Erdtree likely either give it power or imbued with its, the greater will's, will, and redistributed through the lands between so as to spread the influence of the greater will, imbuing life with grace. But how did we get to this perfected monolithic powerhouse? What was there beforehand? And why did it change? There is another theory I am half and half about regarding the state of the Greattree. It doesn't change the end result, but it is a relevant detail nonetheless, and does have implications which I will revisit later on. And that is, instead of the Erdtree growing from within the carcass of the Greattree, it was in fact felled, and what we see in deep root depths is a stump. Perhaps what we see growing from within the Greattree is in fact growing with the Greattree, therefore displaying aspects of the predecessor. The Elden beast, the physical incarnation of order, nestled in this felled tree stump, growing with it and providing its structure and designed or ordered growth, very akin to this tree, which is an artificial method of coppicing, which is, in essence, a tree regrowing from a stump, in this case, using its root system. And this imagery is hardly isolated. We see examples of what appear to be an important priest in the middle of a tree stump with new offshoots growing from the stump, himself nestling the favoured one. To reinforce this further, not only does Marika's cape look like a tree stump she is rising from, like the tree from the stump or carcass of the Greattree, but Radagon is undeniably standing upon and seemingly growing from a tree stump, with very familiar vines wrapping around it. His hair also is becoming part of the backdrop lattice, representing order. If that is the case, and the tree was felled to make way for its regrowth, including the influence of the Elden beast, then I feel like all the components for this age, the age of the Crucible, are summarized quite neatly in the armor of the Orders of the Crucible Knights themselves. We have Ordovus and the axe, also the symbol of Godfrey, the Elden Lord of this age, symbolizing the felling of the Greattree. We have Siluria and her weapon, which is based on the crucible of the Erdtree, so the precursor to the Erdtree, and the matter that comprised it, which was a stump, which housed the Elden beast and was fed innumerable souls over the period of the crucible, and Devonia, with the hammer, to rebuild, to reforge a new age. The symbolism doesn't end there either, as I believe this is meant to be a bird's eye view of a stump, with roots spreading outward. I believe, over this period, the era of the Crucible, an immense number of souls were sacrificed in order to power the primordial Crucible, comprising the matter referred to as the precursor of what we know today as the Erdtree. This would mark the age of the Crucible, of Godfrey and his Crucible Knights, the Erdtree burials which don very telling doors, showing the process I mentioned earlier, though as a footnote, I am not entirely sure if this is the Erdtree, and the Colosseums, where warriors and criminals would fight and die in ritual combat, their souls returning to and nurturing the Greattree roots. We know the catacombs featuring Erdtree burials are connected to the roots of the Greattree, or Great Tree roots, as per the root resin item description, and they are absolutely everywhere in the lands between. Likewise, we know the minor Erdtrees, or perhaps minor Greattrees, are also connected to these roots, as they are always found nestled close by to these catacombs almost every time, if not with jars surrounding them, to feed them and the root system, and therefore the Erdtree. During the age of Godfrey and his Crucible Knights, the Erdtree grew from the remains, be it stump or otherwise, of the Greattree, sustained and fueled by the souls of those from the Erdtree burials, Colosseum fights, and Great Jar sacrifices, funneled to it through the network of Greattree roots. You can think of the Erdtree and the two main trees before it as the largest trees of a quaking aspen, the Tree of Heroes, whose crowns of trembling leaves gave them the power not only to visit the underworld but also to return safely, like Pando or the Great Swamp Tree in Avatar, both which cover an immense expanse and consist of multiple trees of varying sizes. Perhaps this, on an even grander scale, is being hinted at by the description of the knot resin and tree resin, the resin loci likely being corpse wax, hinting at the fact that perhaps all trees share the same roots. That is how vast the Greattree network is. The one great I think this is reinforced further by Godwin and his death root, the fact that he is described as being connected to the roots of the Erdtree and yet is seemingly imbued into a minor Erdtree. Not only is this tree dead, given his position and the position of the tree, plus the presence of a cracked tear regarding the soul and body, the very nature of his affliction and tie to Rani. And if that wasn't enough for you, a contingent of unique priests and omen, both of which use death magic and are totally not a death cult, guard this tree and chalice in place of the usual guardian. The nature and spread of this death root is, in my opinion, further to the root and tree resins combination, clear evidence of the interconnectedness of all trees. As while he is imbued into a minor Erdtree, this has impacted the entire Greattree network, and we see death roots appear in many Erdtree burial catacombs, which we know is connected to the Greattree roots. However, we also see death root appear in random villages, and even in the snow, really demonstrating the reach of this network throughout the lands between. All of this in the effort to corrode the Erdtree's roots and stop the ability of souls to return to it, ending its age of plenty. There is one special room in a building in Lane Dell that I think brilliantly sums up the transition from the age of the Crucible to the age of the Erdtree, with reliefs looking newer and shinier than all others in a unique Crucible orange gold, and when it's exposed to light is a yellow gold. This icon is very akin to the stump icon with shoots growing up from it, or the promising shoots from the birth of the Erdtree. We see these shoots next to the depiction of the Erdtree over and over again, and in the center of the room is a giant, uniquely large, red-gold, crucible-colored depiction of the Erdtree in its infancy. But it doesn't quite look right, like it's been added later on, almost as if to represent the changing of an epoch. And if we look behind it, we see a singularly unique, large, red-gold, crucible-colored depiction of the shoots, replaced and covered by the new iconography and order. If that wasn't enough for you, a Crucible Knight donning the armor of Siluria specifically, whose weapon reads Siluria's Tree, weapon of one of the two honored as foremost among the Crucible Knights. The primordial form of the Erdtree is close in nature to life itself, and this spear, modelled on its crucible, is imbued with ancient holy essence, the primordial state of the Erdtree being its crucible, being the remains of the Greattree, and the souls funneled to it, giving rise to the Erdtree, exactly as her weapon and armour depict, akin to the shoot depictions surrounding her, which would grow to be the Erdtree she is facing. Side note, does his cranium look like roots or brain matter? Eerie. But why would they fell this Greattree just to regrow it? What's the point? Why couldn't the Elden Beast simply nestle atop this Greattree and control the flow of souls some other way? Well, I believe the reason lies in the original sin, and to fix the Greater Will's mistake, that being the fault in the design of the One Great, the mistake that led to fractures, and the removal of souls from the Greattree network, something that was borrowed. And so, what was borrowed must be returned. It is my belief, after my long time researching, that the Greattree that was felled to make way for the Erdtree was one of two original trees of the Greattree network. I believe this network was operated by the functioning of two trees, the Erdtree as we know it simply being the chosen candidate to be supercharged with sacrifices to become the singular entity that would have dominion over and become the new center point of the One Great, and therefore rule the lands between. In fact, many of the locations we associate with the Erdtree, like the burial locations, forts, castles, and the Colosseums, I believe, were once occupied and created by a different but related force, and were created for the purpose of nurturing and spreading the One Great throughout the lands between. Not the Erdtree, but its predecessors, the Trees of Life and Knowledge, otherwise known as the Tree of Death. The Tree of Life is a fundamental archetype in many of the world's mythological, religious, and philosophical traditions. It is closely related to the concept of the sacred tree, the tree of knowledge connecting to heaven and the underworld, such as Yggdrasil, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil in Genesis, and the Tree of Life, connecting all forms of creation, are all forms of the world or cosmic tree, and are portrayed in various religions and philosophies as the same tree. Thank you, Wikipedia. Most scum of resources. And I believe the same is no different for the original composition of the One Great. After my research, I believe it to be an amalgamation of several sacred trees from different cultures and religions. You may not have noticed it in its many forms, but the Tree of Life is very much plastered through the lands between. For example, this is a common depiction we see in many religions of the Tree of Life, and these are from Elden Ring. We have multiple renditions in Farum Azula, such as this, which is tremendously reminiscent of and doubtless drew inspiration from the Tree of Life depiction shown in the Husaby Church, with similar reliefs in Elphael. Or perhaps more convincingly also located in Farum Azula, this tree, bursting with life from a melting pot of life, different beings being formed as they emerge from it, surrounded by these particular little images which seem awfully familiar, that we know for sure are plastered absolutely everywhere through the lands between. The sacred tree is one of the oldest themes in ancient Near Eastern art, and this image is very likely inspired by the image of the Tree of Life shown in ancient Assyrian depictions. To me, these many small tree symbols along the outside of the Tree of Life are depictions of the many minor trees that make up this vast network, and we see this represented on many depictions of the Tree of Life. We see this image of a Tree of Life absolutely everywhere in the lands between, and I mean everywhere, often accompanied or even represented by the palmet or flame palmet. The palmet originated in Egypt and depicts the leaves of a palm, and this symbol was adopted in ancient Greece and is called the anthemion. The Egyptian depictions representing a palm or a lotus is symbolic of the god of creation, Atum, who was said to have created himself out of a palm tree. The tree's ability to regenerate and thrive in harsh desert conditions made it a powerful symbol of rebirth and renewal. Palm trees were often planted in temple gardens and used in religious rituals, with their fronds symbolizing victory and triumph over death. In Greece, the anthemion took on features of other sacred plants, such as the lotus, as well as flame, referred to as the flame palmet. This amalgamation of the palm, lotus, and flame symbolized much of the same, especially rebirth, given the Greek translation of the word palmet is phoenix. Remember that for later. There is a connection to the mythical regenerating solar phoenix and the sacred palm that bore the fruit of immortality. This symbol could very well be the palm as well, however it could also be symbolic of a scallop or seashell, which represents fertility, or the vulva, often depicted at the feet of Aphrodite or Venus, the Greek goddess of fertility and prosperity. And as a side note, the first thing the depiction of the Glomite Queen on the godskin peeler reminded me of was Aphrodite or Venus. Regardless of which it is, palm or shell, the meaning behind the symbols, regardless, is very reminiscent of one another. And we see the symbolism everywhere throughout the lands between, often in the same proximity as one another, including on gravestones found all through the lands between, from the peaks of the mountaintops of the giants to the Weeping Peninsula, and the sizes vary greatly. Also another one to remember for later. So, sure, perhaps the Tree of Life exists, and okay, these symbols are absolutely everywhere. How do we go about narrowing down any of this, or making sense of these connections? Where, or what is, the Tree of Life that existed before the Erdtree? Well, buckle up, because I'm about to show you a lot of associations. This is where the video adopts an entirely different pace. We see common themes and motifs and an absence of common themes and motifs between the civilizations and locations in Elden Ring, and I believe their presence or lack of indicate a great deal about the timeline. And as I ventured through all of the locations in the lands between, I came to realize that almost everything everywhere is a melding of two ancient locations. I believe these two ancient locations were of the same civilization, but two aspects of that civilization. The divine higher sphere of Farum Azula, domain of the golden ancient dragons, chosen race of the greater will, and their beastmen, stewards of the kingdom of the sun, that governed the lands between and controlled the armies of the Stormlord and Beastlord for the One Great. And the lower sphere of Elphael, the Deathrite priests, first of the Gravekeepers, the Tibia Mariner, and staff-wielding human royalty and their forces that govern the rites of death and burial, the burning of the body and the guiding of the spirit through burial and water to the Greattree roots, with both the deathbirds and mariners many ties to the moon and stars. The two locations share similar but uniquely different iconography, as you would expect between two distinct spheres of existence that were related as part of the same civilization. The first is the upper sphere, Farum Azula, that has been crumbling since time immemorial, home to the Elden Lord that existed before the time of the Erdtree. The beastmen there don shields depicting the kingdom of the sun, a kingdom that has long since faded. Like the gold of the now petrified ancient dragons that inhabit this Olympus, imagine these regal beings in their prime, adorned entirely in gold. Now, like the once very vibrant trees of this land, faded and petrifying. It is safe to assume that this sacred mausoleum suspended beyond time, again described as having been crumbling since time immemorial, is perhaps one of, if not the oldest location in the lands between. And following that logic, as such the symbolism found in Farum Azula likely originated there. And where we find the symbolism and artifacts of Farum Azula throughout the lands between would be indicative of its influence, spread, and presence. These forces were represented throughout the lands between by 4 old flags. The flag of the Lord of the Beasts, which is confirmed to be Sirosh, who joined Godfrey, I imagine, after his defeat, and was the Lord of the Beasts in service of Farum Azula before this. The flag of the Stormlord, who I wager may be Grandsax, given his size and the weapon he uses being similar to that of the King of Dragons, Plasidusax. The flag of the Greattree, not to be confused with the Erdtree version, which adopted a new colour scheme, and some iconography down the bottom was also changed after the fall of the Old Order, and the flag depicting an amalgamation of all of these things. A lion with dragon-looking features and a tree-like tail, adorning the knights and commanders of the Old Order. Given where we find this symbolism, I am led to believe it is indicative of the primary and military forces of Farum Azula, headed likely by the Lord of the Storm and the Lord of the Beasts, who is said to be drawn to lords. After all, we see these very beasts, such as Malekith, in and statues of them in Farum Azula. Allow me to demonstrate the reach of Farum Azula through some of the symbolism and iconography that we find there, that shows up throughout the lands between. Foundationally, the single vine icon that has a leaf nestled by, though hard to see at times, found throughout Farum Azula, is also found on the bridges leading to and out of the Divine Towers, every fort in the game, every main castle in the game, Castle Sol, Langdell, Mesmer's Castle, Carrion Manor, Stormvale, Redmane Castle, Castle Morn, the Carrion Study Hall, the Eternal Cities. The X symbol found throughout Farum Azula is found essentially everywhere. The Grand Lifts, Langdell, Carrion Manor, Celia, Ordina, Elphael. We find this lone flower symbol here in Castle Sol, at the very top of the map, and at the Bestial Sanctum at the very bottom of the map. We find this flower symbol in between these locations, from Farum Azula to the Grand Lifts, Langdell, Rea Lucaria, and at the very bottom at the Bestial Sanctum. We also find this exact flower motif in Farum in Langdell, Volcano Manor, and the Eternal Cities and Mausoleums. And speaking of the Volcano Manor, we find the same braziers from Farum Azula, the Bestial Sanctum, and Dragon Communion churches, as well as the Dragon Pit in Volcano Manor, outside of the Temple of Eagle. The pillars are also seen in the catacombs, heroes' graves, Langdell, and potentially some churches and Stormvale. Furthermore, we find the lamprey-esque motifs in some fairly unusual places, such as the Grand Lifts, Langdell, Colosseums, and all over Rea Lucaria, even underneath Renala, of all places. But we also see the depiction of the King and Queen from Farum Azula here as well. We find these very coffins all over the lands between. And we see this symbol from Farum Azula often beneath statues of certain important figures, but with a shield in front of it, even for the dragons. And we see it absolutely everywhere, often held by this woman, but we'll get back to her much later on. The bestial soldiers of this civilization wore outfits adorned with vine motifs, the sun, and the kingdom of the sun, and wielded the red lightning of the ancient dragons. The humanoid soldiers of this civilization don ancient dragons on their helm akin to the symbol found on the old flag, and even seemingly a melding of all of the old flags. A draconic looking lion with a tree or floral looking tail, as well as familiar iconography. And aside from having powers over the storm, the commander's notably a snowstorm. Some are even capable of using Dragon Communion incantations to breathe fire, reinforcing their ties and service to the ancient dragons. Looking back at the symbolism used during the spreading of these forces, I believe the associations come very full circle in this room found in Stormvale. Here we find the armor of the Banished Knights, whose armor bears an ancient dragon atop its helm, and the head wrap and flag of the commanders bears a symbol of a beast, an amalgamation of the beast and dragon of the old flags and potentially, given the nature of its tail, the Greattree. We see these flags together again in the Round Table Hold, which I believe to have been like the headquarters of Old Langdell, where we find an abundance of Banished Knight armor and weaponry. And we once again find the flags of the Old Order of the Greattree and the Dragon Lord, of all places, in Volcano Manor. Notably, each one of the heroes' graves don a separate one of each of these flags. The dragon, the beast, the tree, though this one appears to have been replaced with its new rendition, the Erdtree, and then finally the ruling force behind it all. The Two Fingers, envoys of the Greater Will. These hero tombs are also protected by magic that displays the symbol of the Erdtree, or what I would argue, the age of the creation of the Erdtree, before the Golden Order. And there are many reasons why I think this came before the Golden Order. For now, I will just say the Finger Reader Enya tells us to become Elden Lord and restore the Golden Order, not the age of the Erdtree. We find the old flags in many of the same areas I mentioned earlier, the flag of the beast more often than not appearing in churches, which all have the same pillars, flower iconography, and are always accompanied by this tree symbol on the site the church is built at. Even in Caria Manor, which appears to have been built with the buildings themselves, predating the known alliances. The flag of the dragon is displayed in the Round Table Hold and even in Volcano Manor. The flag of the Greattree, not to be confused with the Erdtree, is found in Stormvale, and the amalgamation is found wielded by the soldiers, and notably the commanders of the forces, found at the very top near the first unique flower sigil, and at the very bottom, the other unique flower sigil, the eldest commanders being at the top, and the younger or son of that very general, as shown by the naming convention, at the very bottom. I genuinely feel like the location of these unique flower icons and the position of these two ancient commanders is indicative of the origin and destination of the civilization from the top to the bottom. I theorize that Banished Knights and Commanders were the Knights and Crucible equivalent of the Old Order, their forces who built the forts and main buildings throughout the lands between that more often than not hold their weaponry, that share the same vine and tree iconography, whose citadel was Old Langdell with the Round Table Hold as its main castle, all which was later co-opted and built upon by the conquering forces. This Old Order of Knights was likely the first to partake of Dragon Communion, given their abilities and the presence around the Dragon Communion Church in Caelid, with potentially Volcano Manor, which not only has the flags of the Old Order, but also has these braziers, flower symbology from Farum and the Dragon Communion, as some form of headquarters or meeting point for their operations or champions. Very tellingly, and as if a glimpse into the past, if you care to count it, and I don't mind if not, in version 1 of the game, Langdell was actually full of Banished Knights and not Langdell Knights, and there was even a Banished Knight worshipping the corpse of Grandsax. So having established connections between Farum Azula and essentially every location in the game, at the end of it, I believe it makes the story somewhat clearer, based on what icons we see where and what ones we do not. Farum Azula's influence was spread throughout the lands between before the age of the Erdtree, and was undoubtedly tethered to its royalty and military. But there is more to this civilization than its military, and there is another ancient location at the base of an ancient and great tree that is absolutely shrouded in mysterious and unique icons and depictions, found all over the lands between, and concentrated in areas regarding death and divinity. As we travel through the canopy and town of Miquella's Haligtree, it isn't hard to notice the distinct architecture and colouring, the gorgeous white elven patterns and statues of Miquella and his sister. And so when we transition from the Haligtree's canopies after our battle against Loretta to the lower levels of this Greattree, it isn't hard to notice the obvious change in architecture, material, colour, and reliefs, in place of the white polished elven patterns and statues of Miquella and his sister, which we see no more of. We find an array of bizarre and confounding depictions, as well as many different tree motifs, all presenting a singular tree, and one in particular with newborn life all around it, bearing fruit, and in my opinion depicting the tree of life and its denizens in its infancy, perhaps just as this depiction of the tree of life in Farum, alluding to everything, all life, having come from the tree, and hinting at further sinister knowledge. There is a lot to say about this top area, and the depictions it shows, and the associations and implications of that. And trust me, there are both reasons for why it is there, and a lot to say on it, but for this video, I want to focus specifically on the difference between this area, which seems far newer, far different to the architecture below, with only a few homages to important iconography from the civilization below, and none of its many unique depictions. In addition, if these two areas were truly in fact related, and they are both so grand, why are they separated by a ladder? It's very odd. While the details in this section of the tree contain details from literally all of the ancient civilizations, from Farum Azula, the bottom of Elphael, Rao ruins, the giants, and the eternal cities, I don't personally think this was made during the same period, especially with how all of these designs are a unique variation, and in such a polished, marble-like texture. I just couldn't move on without mentioning this here, because it really did stop me in my tracks. If it was made during the same period, that would suggest that this tree was always a helix tree, despite every single depiction in the area, bar one, which is a bit of a reach, depicting a singular tree. I think instead this section was created by Miquella, and the vast array of ancient iconography demonstrates his understanding of everything, of his roots, of the part all of these civilizations have played in the world we live today, his understanding of the whole of it. That is why we see iconography in this second shoot in a much more modern and preserved material, but that is for another video. It is my argument that this is in fact two trees, much like the Greattree and the Erdtree. There are many differences between Miquella's Haligtree and Elphael, as I just covered, and the conclusion I have drawn is that just how the Erdtree is something that was grown from the Greattree, Miquella grew the Haligtree from the remains of the tree that was originally here. If they were both meant to be the Haligtree Miquella was growing, like a helix such as a Skardu tree, why does it only seem like one side is growing, with new branches all over it, and a closed stump on the end, while the other side isn't growing whatsoever, and is hollow? In fact, this side, I would argue, is a new growth, and is growing very akin to the minor Erdtrees in the minor Erdtree church beside Leyndell, and the smaller plants or saplings shown in the ancient reliefs, and is noticeably thinner and newer than the other, thicker stump. Why does sap only come from the side that appears to be growing, while the other is bone dry? Why are all of the reliefs in Elphael of a single tree, and not of a helix tree with one reach of an exception? In fact, on the medallion that allows us passage here, flanked by two unknown kings, and not, say, Miquella, the tree depicted is notably singular. And why is the brace seemingly only built around the middle, hollow, dry stump? Why are there no reliefs of Miquella and Melania after the promenade at the top of the new tree? It is likely because just like Miquella's statues in Ordina, it would look very out of place, as it is of an entirely different material and age. It isn't until the promenade leading to the ancient lower levels of the original tree stump that we see depictions of what once was. And on the other side of this door, with a uniquely tangled vine design, we see hints of the city below, but of a totally different texture, as if made much later. And all of this separated not by a lift or integrated structural design, but a ladder that doesn't even seem to be the intended purpose of this watchtower. I believe because what is happening here is akin to coppicing, where a new tree grows from the stump of an old tree, only on its side. I'm still half and half about this, so if you think otherwise, please let me know in the comments, as I am open to changing my mind about it originally being a helix tree, like on the interleaved Great Shield, though I have a different opinion on this. but there are just so many indications that it was originally at least not a helix, meaning the top section was built far later, and likely by Mikola. I had the same dilemma regarding the Greattree of the Erdtree, as the stump to me clearly denotes two stumps likely originating from the same origin, but still likely resulting in a spiral. However, the model clearly indicates a single tree, just like all of the iconography in Leyndell. Both of these trees very well could have been spiral trees, but that detail isn't pertinent to the video, and the main point I am trying to establish is that there were two ancient trees in the age before the Erdtree. Regardless, these are the types of questions I absolutely love discussing, so after the video, please let me know what you think in the comments. So if the Haligtree, or rather Elphael, wasn't grown from scratch by Mikola, then who created these depictions? And what was this tree, enveloped in a city akin to how Leyndell envelops the Erdtree, before Mikola co-opted its corpse? How did it end up this way? There are many unique depictions in Elphael that establish connections between it and Farum Azula, and many other locations in the lands between, but most notably and distinctly the catacombs and tombs, and the divine towers. And I believe that speaks heavily to its nature and role in this civilization. We see vine-like designs strikingly similar but distinctly different to Farum Azula, the type of differences you would expect to see between a higher and lower sphere of a civilization. Elphael's depictions not being quite as elaborate or pristine in many cases, but still of a very high quality, and observably ancient. We see these exact vine depictions in the divine towers, the Giant's Forge, all catacombs and heroes' graves, the Chapel of Anticipation. The flower iconography I mentioned earlier from Farum Azula also appears in Elphael, however we don't see this unique design found in Elphael in Farum, which also appears in other locations. We see it more often than not in chapels, such as the chapel in Castle Sol. Temple of Iglay has an exact copy, Redmane Castle, Carrion Manor, Stormvale. We also see it on the Giant's Forge, Heroes' Graves, Grand Lifts, Leyndell's Walls, and Raya Lucaria, and even possibly the Ul Ruins, where it possibly originated, and or the stone ship coffins. There is this swell motif in Elphael that dons a strange small figure which we see everywhere through the lands between, without the figure. The Divine Tower, Eternal Cities, Ruins on vases, and more. These pillars from Elphael are also found in all ruins, the Grand Cloister, Bestial Sanctum, Raya Lucaria, Grand Lifts, and the Suppressing Pillar. And these pillars from Elphael are also found on the bridges leading to and out of the front of the Divine Towers and in the Carrion Study Hall. And both of these types of pillar designs are found in Volcano Manor. This chalice, which appears in Elphael 3 times, also appears in Leyndell several times, and also appears in the Shadowlands at the SekiroDubi viewing area. We also see striking similarities between the coffin motifs of Elphael and Raya Lucaria, but that's for much later. But to really reiterate just how much iconography from Elphael is plastered all over the burial locations, especially the heroes' graves, which, may I remind you, Farum Azula literally is a burial location. The exact same vine iconography, the exact same unique tree of life iconography, the exact same budding iconography, exact same flower iconography, skull iconography, similar building archaeology to the Church of Prayer in Elphael, and so on. So we can see a connection between Elphael and most, if not all, major locations in the lands between, especially the burial locations. All places that also have iconography and motifs from Farum Azula. And we see these similarities between Farum Azula and Elphael, as well as the melding of their iconography and motifs, all throughout the lands between. I think these relationships are important and give us insight into the relationship between the higher sphere of Farum Azula and the lower sphere of Elphael. There are many links between Elphael and Farum Azula, especially in the places where both of their iconography appear. Let's go ahead and cover a few. There is another tree depiction in Farum Azula, which has 2 beasts either side of it. The beasts, especially goats, lions, or birds, flanking a tree of life is also a common depiction in ancient arts across multiple cultures. This depiction is tremendously reminiscent of the two beasts we see either side of this tree in Elfeal, which is further reminiscent of the depictions of two beasts we see throughout the lands between, in the Chapel of Anticipation, beneath many statues of Marika, Mesmer's Chamber, Lane Dell, the ancient dynastic ruins, on the stone coffins, and in the Colosseums. As for the Colosseum iconography, we also find here the flags of the Old Order, but if we actually use these Colosseums via the Shadow Round Table hold, the flags are adorned with the parties that now respectively own and operate these Colosseums, after the fall of the Old Order, built originally by the Old Order. We also see iconography akin to the flower motifs in which we discussed earlier, with the prevalence of this double swirl as depicted in Elfeal, and found throughout the lands between, but lacking the little giant at the top. However, here, we in fact see him present. The hero graves are absolutely laced with motifs from Elfeal and contain each rendition of the flag of the Old Order, and are also adorned with the pillars of Farum Azula, the same pattern which shows on the pillars of the fire-breathing imps. The catacombs are also laden with the pillars of Farum Azula, contain the vine iconography of Elfeal, and those catacombs and graves contain the very same jars found in the ancient ruins, which is very reminiscent of the pottery that we find in Farum Azula, which contain both Farum and Elfeal motifs, but we will discuss the ancient ruins soon enough. Both of them have depictions of a tree bursting with life, with ancient renditions of what appears to be the Tree of Life. Both of them contain iconography of the Eternal Bloom, which is a Tree of Life depiction from the Taj Mahal. There is a baby holding fruit in Farum Azula, just as found on the trees depicted in Elfeal. The human soldiers, priests, and dead are wielding a staff, just like the royalty in Farum Azula. Even the divine towers have both of their iconography. The pillars from Elfeal and the vine from Farum Azula are on the way to the towers. The lamprey tail-eating beast from Farum Azula and the exact vine image from Elfeal. And you'll notice a striking similarity between these patterns on the divine towers and this inverted tree of life from Farum Azula, which we also see in the ancient dynastic ruins, and archways with people floating in them, akin to those in the catacombs and tombs, which, as we just discussed, have iconography from both Elfeal and Farum Azula. And a quick relevant side note on the divine towers and bridges that lead to them is, if you're going to argue that these are parts of different cultures, as I have seen many argue the divine towers are entirely separate to Lane Dell, where do you draw the line? If it is the bridge, then is it the entryway? If it is the entryway, then why do we see the same vine and pathway as used in Farum Azula and Elfeal? And not just on the path to the divine towers, but on the entryway in front of the doors. That same entryway with the braziers from inside of the tower on them. Those very same braziers that even have the same iconography as the pillars in Lane Dell Colosseum, and throughout Lane Dell. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, but back to a few more associations between Farum Azula and Elfeal. Both of them appear to be mass graves, and heavily death-themed, with Farum Azula being described as a flying mausoleum donning mass graves with the dead merging into the walls, and Elfeal, which has skulls and graves all around it, and is heavily associated with the catacombs and tombs, donning what appears to be a mass grave, with the dead merging into the walls. Tellingly, there are only two places in the base game I have found with a concentration of red trees, and specifically these red trees, though the ones in Farum look as though they have been kicked in the gut. And as we move from the bottom of the lands between to the top, we will see the colour of the trees progress, just like the commanders of the Old Order, from young or green in the south, with the only orange trees found nestle around minor Erdtrees, to the mid-sphere of the lands between, where we see fields of yellow and orange trees. However, even by the Erdtree, no red trees. It isn't until we go to the furthest point north, to Elfeal, that we see red trees. Vibrant and crimson, and the only other place we find red trees is Farum Azula. They are not as vibrant as those in Elfeal, but I'd attribute this to the fact that everything in Farum Azula appears to be losing its colour and becoming petrified, as displayed by the dragons and in the trees. So the further north you go, the more red or old, like the commander in the north, the trees are. You can even see a red tinge in these spectral trees. Red trees denoting autumn, the season of death. And many of these trees being pines, which we see a concentration of in Farum Azula. Finally, I would like to return to the Tibia Mariner and Deathbirds and their death priests. The Tibia Mariner are the oldest of gravekeepers. They guide the dead who perished in battle via the water to the roots, and their wood lamp that they use to guide the dead who have died in battle, which is similar to the appearance of grace, such as the red grace-like miasma we find in the north, perhaps the grace before grace, is Helfen's steeple. Throughout the lands between, at places linked by the Old Order, we find renditions of Helfen's steeple, sometimes with a tree in front with small but proportionally gigantic people in front of it, or a lady with a shield, with what appear to be potentially wings in the background, standing between two trees. Given Farum Azula is one of, if not the oldest location in the game, it is noteworthy that this symbolism shows there, so likely originates from there. We see the imagery of Helfen's steeple also in Elphael in multiple locations, and importantly, the coffins in the roots have very important symbols above their heads. I'll be noting on later, which we also see the figures in the moving mausoleums and in Rhea Lucaria, and the design echoed in Rhea Lucaria and the Chapel of Anticipation. This has Helfen's steeple also adorning it, which makes sense given what it's adorning. While there are many Tibia Mariner throughout the lands between trying to guide the souls lost in death after battle, it isn't until we reach the north of the map where all of the red trees are, right by Castle Sol, the stronghold with the oldest commander of the Old Order, and first of the unique flower symbols, that it drops Helfen's steeple. But we will be coming back to this in the next chapter a little later on. All throughout Farum Azula we see references to the twin birds, which are envoys of an outer god. Their children, the Deathrite birds, burned away death indiscriminate in a time before the Erdtree. We see the Deathrite birds throughout the lands between becoming more complete and powerful the closer we get to Elphael, the exception being Caelid, which is close to the bestial sanctum, and the original junior commander of the Old Order, and more devolved the further away from the source or origin. Their iconic Deathrite ritual spear is only dropped in the north, near Elphael, the very same one wielded by the priests of Deathrites who we see embedded in their wings, and I believe on the motifs in the ancient ruins and suppressing pillar. While Farum Azula, the higher sphere, ruled over the one great, being the Greattree network stretching through all of the lands between, and dictated the movement of the armies and the royalty of the Kingdom of the Sun, Elphael was the lower sphere, and the stewards of death, home to the priests that manage death throughout the lands between. The Deathrite birds to the twin birds, who would burn away death, and their death priests, who we see in the motifs in the ancient ruins, would follow the Deathbirds, likely collecting the ash to bury in the catacombs by the Greattree roots, storing their ashes in urns by the roots for the spirits to rest, sworn to their solemn duty for the promise of their eventual rebirth. The Tibia Mariner, oldest of the gravekeepers, who would guide those lost in death who died in battle through the waterways to the tree roots, or otherwise buried in the catacombs which are covered in Elphael and Farum motifs, guided by the death priest Rhosus, though he may have come into the equation later during the age of the Crucible. Rhosus's axe has a special that is called Rhosus Summons, which is identical to the spell Tibia Summons. He also wields a staff like the figures we see all throughout Elphael and the royalty in Farum too, and its design is also reminiscent of the cycle motifs we find in the ancient ruins. The upper sphere Farum Azula containing iconography of the twin bird, and the lower sphere Elphael containing depictions of its children, the Deathrite birds, in an age where their ghost flame would burn away death, white-winged maidens. After all, these birds do in fact have feathers, and while yes, half of them are dark, half of them are lighter. I would wager that they did not always look like this. After all, how long has it been since they were the ones to operate the functions of death? A really great example that was shown to me by Chocolate Scott, whose YouTube channel you can see here, which I refused to believe at first but was completely won over by, is Plasidusax. The Old Lord's talisman depicts the Dragon King in his prime, when he was Elden Lord. Yes, he has 4 heads in this depiction, and many rightly argue that he likely had 5, but I would argue he simply lost one of these heads on his journey to lordship. If Godfrey lost an arm in a war and eventually became Elden Lord years later, would the statue they make of him to mark the occasion have 1 or 2 arms? Anyway, that isn't what I wanted to focus on. What is extremely interesting is the fact that upon closer inspection, Plasidusax looks absolutely nothing like he does now. His features appear more wolf or dog-like, not sharp and petrified stone or skeletal. Frankly, Plasidusax looks like the dragon from Neverending Story or Howl's Moving Castle here, more than the petrified stone skeleton Dragon King we see today. I guess that's what an entire age worth of time and the loss of 2 more heads will do to you. After all, look what's happening to the trees in Farum. Even the 2 fingers were once allegedly full of vigor. So if Plasidusax was once upon a time a fluffy boy, or at least far more biological in appearance, perhaps the same can be said for the Deathrite birds. Perhaps they were not always the scraggly, messed up version we see today. We do after all see different more or less complete versions of them in the current context. I wonder what they would have looked like an age ago, in the time when they operated death. Perhaps something akin to the depictions we see in Elphael of human-faced, bird-like creatures in pairs, reminiscent of the twin birds, Elphael being the only location that depicts such winged entities, as well as angels, or winged maidens. And in a catacomb at the furthest point south of the map, we find the winged scythe, which describes Death's gentle envoys, the white-winged maidens. And below this depiction, on this very scythe between 2 wings, is a maiden. Potentially. In some light it looks like she has a beard, but who we know at least certainly has a beard are the bearded men beneath her, very reminiscent of the Tibia Mariner and Deathrite priests on ancient reliefs, the agents of death, and someone else who I will be mentioning later. I genuinely believe these 2 forces, the Tibia Mariner as well as the Deathrite birds, were the operators of death on behalf of the Kingdom of the Sun. Not only are the twin birds associated with the moon, with Deathrite birds only appearing at night, but the Tibia Mariner's cloaks are adorned with a unique star and water pattern, very reminiscent of the water pattern from Farum Azula and somewhere else that is known to worship the moon. But that is a topic for another video. Additionally, the DLC further exemplifies this relationship or pairing by both the theme of loneliness, having the Tibia Mariner creating items to help them cope with their solitude, and the grave birds being created to keep the Deathrite birds company. And the only Deathrite bird and Tibia Mariner found in the DLC are both located in Caro's grave. Lastly, if the hue of Ghostflame was once purple, then perhaps in the age of their prime, with white feathers and more biological features, the hue of the Deathrite bird's flames were purple. I find it fitting then that the Tibia Mariner themselves are not only purple, but the giants that they summon don an infinity braid ring on their wedding finger, with what looks almost to be a purple eye in the middle. Even if that doesn't flesh out, the blue ghost flame of the Deathbirds and purple aura of the Tibia Mariner are in my eyes assuredly a pair, as described by the blue ghost flame bloom, which reads, "Ghost flame flower that grows in gravesites, blossoms in the hidden grave of Caro, of a pair with another gravesite flower, the grave violet," and the grave violet, which reads, "The hue of ghost flame." It's believed to be useful in calling forth spirits. So that should explain by operational standards what I mean when I say lower sphere and higher sphere. Yes, but I also hypothesize this is in the literal sense. I think that just like Elphael, a mass grave, is found at the base of this tree, I believe that Farum Azula, a mass grave, sat at the top of the same tree before it was forcibly removed, which I will also note on later. If the ancient dragons in Farum Azula were at the pinnacle of existence, the flying city, would it not make sense that it would occupy the highest peaks of the highest sphere in the lands between? If their god, after all, is the greater will and the two fingers, given the gift of fingers given to the beastmen as per Sinkadir, the whole fleeing god thing, and the fact the ancient dragons low-key look like they're wearing a finger crown, then it would make sense that in the same area we find the absolute largest and most finger creepers, the most northern, most grand, and most ancient hero grave, has the flags of the two fingers, something seen nowhere else in the lands between. The same area where the Deathbirds are most complete and strongest and drop the Deathrite spear, and the same area where we get the Hellfen steeple from the Mariners. Just like how the trees in the south are a young green, the trees in the Midlands are an aged yellow, and the trees in the north are an elderly red, as seen in this video by the NamelessSinger, just like the Gold Road moving from north to south, denoting the civilization originating in the north. I have a theory that these giants were originally built to accompany these carriages, which I think are giant coffins, perhaps used to courier these bodies to this ancient tree. And we see these nodules on their backs with what appear to be ropes tied around them, with which I imagine they once pulled along these carriages. And we can see evidence of this at the abandoned coffin cliff, where we find lots of these abandoned coffins, and right beside them, without any weapons anywhere, these giant golems, as the carriages all face the direction of the mountaintops, with exception to one that follows the path to Volcano Manor. And the very last one we see in the consecrated snowlands ends its journey right next to Ordina, which I believe at one point may have been connected to the original tree before a disaster happened. Just like the unique flower symbology showing north and south, just like the youngest commander being in the south and the eldest in the north, even the smithing stones seem to represent the north as containing the most ancient and powerful relics, with the smithing stones right before the ones identified with the ancient dragon scales, the ones referencing and insinuating that they came from Farum Azula being specifically described as being located in polar regions, and mostly found in the north. Would it not make sense that the ancient sacred mausoleums be located past the ancient boughs in the consecrated or sacred snowlands, engulfed in a snowstorm like the commanders of the Old Order are able to wield? And just visually, the way Farum Azula is structured suggests to me it was at some point structured around something, given the red trees appear to be found high up, or north at least. Given there are tree roots all over Farum Azula, it's easy to picture a tree going through its center here, instead of a tornado, like a bird's nest reaching towards the sun, and it would have looked like the sun at the peak of this tree, with all of the golden dragons. And for a sense of scale of how large this tree may have once been, consider that not only is it already growing to the peaks of the mountaintops, but that those mountaintops are home to the most ancient and largest boughs in the game. Dead though they may be, a collection of trees this size, scale, and in such proximity is seen absolutely nowhere else in the base game, above ground at least. The closest maybe would be the forest south of Langdell, whose largest trees only maybe reach the height of the smallest of what's left of these ancient trees, and comparable only to the forest of Midra's Mans in the DLC. As a further note to the relationship is the shape and form of the rune shown in Farum Azula. I've heard many insinuate that it's meant to represent tree roots, and wouldn't it fit nicely that the tree at the top of the map would have its roots journey down and spread throughout the lands between? But there are more reasons that compel this thought in me, and that is that at the very top of this depiction of a great tree in its prime that has a tall and thin stature, much akin to the tall and thin stature of the dead tree in Elphael, that is striking in resemblance to the tall and thin dead tree we see on the belfries, and in front of Langdell on the spectral banners, the only other spectral trees we see being the tall pine trees of the north, and the other tree depictions with a canopy reaching down towards its base. We see something perched in the very top, with a regal floral decorated crown beneath it. This object invokes the imagery of both the Helfen steeple depiction above the entombed figures, and the pot that the Tree of Life is seen bursting from in the depictions of Farum Azula. And you'll note that this pot looks like a flower, which makes sense given we see flower iconography all over the crown and construct, having even the same points or edges on the tops of them. On the secret medallion that takes us to the path leading to Elphael, the same depiction is shown at the base of this tree, including the archways. And while it's very hard to get a clear image of, you can see at the very top of the construct on the medallion, points, likely depicting the city of the priests. Even the crown of the bearded staff-wielding giant kings on the talisman leading to this ancient mausoleum, much like those we find in Farum Azula, again not Mikola, looks akin to the depiction. I believe this represents Farum Azula, a sacred grave for dragons, the divine creatures, sitting atop this tree, both depicted by the same looking object on the medallion and the Lord's throne, the mausoleums of the upper and lower spheres. This tree reminds me of the one with small 8 infants crawling all around it from Elphael, reflecting that lineage in its prime, during the prime of this tree. Now bearded men, the priests of Elphael. Finally, if I'm right about the fact that this was originally such an important and grand tree, then what the hell happened to it? The reason, aside for now, I think that also may possibly link Farum and Elphael, as we know for certain that Farum Azula was struck by a meteor, and that led to its current state. And much like how the Eternal Cities were assailed and devastated by an Astel having invoked the ire of the Greater Will, located in the peaks of the consecrated snowlands about the same distance from Elphael as the Astel that destroyed Noxtella, is an Astel. It is my theory that this tree was devastated by this Astel to stop the Greattree network in its tracks and put a pause to the Greater Will's mistake, after the rise of the Fell God. As for the debris of Farum Azula appearing everywhere south of the mountaintops and not in the mountaintops of the giants, if this tree was originally, say, the size or similar to the Erdtree, given what I previously said about its location and the trees in that area, and a meteorite struck it, I couldn't imagine the fallout. I imagine it had turned the surrounding area into nothing short of a wasteland. How far would it go before it struck the ground, and how much of it would have fallen into the chasms below? Did it float for a while before landing, as Farum Azula still is, as other impact sites of meteors do when struck with asteroids? The ruined greatsword, which appears to be a fraction of Farum Azula, stating it was struck by an asteroid, is imbued with the power of gravity as a result of having been struck. The demonstrated gravity anomalies at impact sites leaves plenty of room for interpretation on this point. I believe the direction of this hail of stars is consistent with the appearance of what Tarnished Archeologist identifies as being from the splashes of magma on the Divine Towers, like a meteorite shower, a founding rain of stars. Though he noted there was no consistent evidence between the direction, I would disagree, as if we take into account the direction of both Astels, where they are from their intended target, it seems to me to match the sides the debris appears on the Divine Towers. As for the forge, I'd think it'd more likely be overflow, given where we see this magma-looking material are pretty much exactly where these cracks in the forge are. Aside from the associations I mentioned earlier, why would I say Farum would be above this tree specifically? Why is this tree so slender compared to the Erdtree and depictions of the Greattree? I have my reservations about Farum Azula atop this tree as much as I do about Elphael or the Greattree of Leyndell always having been a helix tree, so I'm open to changing my mind, as Leyndell is a tremendously Farum-coded area, smack bang in the middle of the 2 unique flower icons near the commanders of the Old Order. Where Farum ultimately is located doesn't impact the video much, but I have my own theory and I will explain why I think what I do. And I do look forward to seeing what you have to say in the comments. In addition to the other 2 reasons and associations I stated, a main reason for my theory about Farum Azula and the fact that there are 2 trees that comprise the One Great is due to what I consider to be one of the most unmentioned and overt secrets in the game, and what led to the downfall of the One Great, the flaw in the design, the mistake by the Greater Will, leading to fractures in the One Great network, the fruit of the One Great, of the Tree of Life and the Tree of Knowledge, also referred to as the Tree of Death. There are numerous religious tropes and inspirations in Elden Ring. Even the Tree of Life, as it were, in Elden Ring is drawn from many real-life inspirations, and we see its depiction in every corner of the game. So, given I am advocating for the existence of one Greattree network operated by two main trees of life and death, you can imagine, based on what I just showed you, how perplexed I was about where to even start with this. Which tree was the tree I was looking for, which would give me insight into the one great of the lands between. And after reading about a dozen or so sacred trees and the mythology surrounding them, I realized that the likelihood was that it was inspired by and included elements of multiple of them. When I was pondering where the first of the Greattree network was, of course, I originally began at Leyndell, given the enormity of the Greattree stump and the lack of any other real contender, and the unique ancient nameless city by its decaying bough. But after I investigated Elfale, and well, you've heard all about that, I was heavily conflicted about the original Greattree, as both of these locations were prime candidates, given their enormity and context. And then, during my pinballing between these locations and Farum Azula to try and make sense of it all, I noticed something that caught my eye in all locations. And once I saw it everywhere. This confirmed for me my initial suspicion that there was perhaps more than one tree involved. Depicted in Leyndell and some other locations, we find two intertwining branches with different leaves and different fruit. The same variation of fruit we find depicted on this tree in Elfale, the round fruit at the forefront and the berry-like fruit in the background. I would argue, just like the veil being torn back, this is to symbolize that they are part of the same system, of the one great, but belonging to a different tree. Like this interleaved tree shield, which is the same tree linking in its canopy and existence, just as how I see the one great. I think this is literally what we see in this image in Elfale, two trees that are of the same root system and an important part of one another. Two trees, one shared existence. Two trees, one system. And we see a tree depicted here in Elfale, depicting the berry-like fruit we see the lamprey eating when they transform, with a canopy reaching the bottom of the tree, much like the depictions of the tree with the crown and steeple, and like the dead tree imagery in Elfale. But is this a fruit or berry? Or something else? If we revisit this depiction I showed you earlier, you'll notice this very handsome birdman, who symbolizes the enlightened man in Mesopotamia, is holding something. He's holding a pine cone. Yes, a pine cone. Did you know that the Pope has a pine cone on his staff? And that there is a giant bronze pine cone in the Vatican? Or that the staff of Osiris, the Egyptian god of life, death, fertility, resurrection, and rebirth, also has a pine cone on it, flanked by intertwining serpents? I did not. Apparently the pine cone, which is a seed-bearing fruit, is used in many cultures to symbolize human enlightenment, the third eye, and the pineal gland. Conifer pine trees are one of the most ancient plant genera on the planet, having existed nearly 3 times longer than all flowering plant species. The pine cone is the evolutionary precursor to the flower, and its spines spiral in a perfected Fibonacci sequence in either direction, much like the sacred geometry of a rose or sunflower, or the pattern hidden under evergails. Our pineal gland, shaped like and named after the pine cone, is at the geometric center of our brain and is intimately linked to our body's perception of light. The pineal modulates our wake-sleep patterns and circadian rhythms, remains uniquely isolated from the blood-brain barrier system, and receives a higher percentage of blood flow than any other area of the body, save the kidneys. It is considered by many to be our biological third eye, the seat of the soul, the epicenter of enlightenment, and its sacred symbol throughout history in cultures around the world has been the pine cone. And where do we find spectral fields of conifer pines, with ancient boughs boasting height unseen, and the site of an ancient divine art, requiring, I would assume, divine knowledge or enlightenment? Why the north? by the destroyed Greattree of Elphael. While they are clearly the most interesting in the north, being so uniquely spectral, the pine trees aren't the only trees we see in the lands between, nor even the north. In fact, we see these trees, which may have at one point been the very same tree we see in Elphael and Farum Azula, splitting at the base, and then again multiple times to meet eventually in the canopy like the interleaven tree. I had a realization that throughout the lands between and the DLC, especially in Farum Azula and Elphael, we see mostly the same type of trees everywhere. Mostly conifers like yew and pine, and many oak. We also see many aspens in specific places as well. All of these trees are depicted as a sacred tree in one culture or religion, and the themes between them are very similar in many ways. We see the pine and oak close to one another in the north, which I imagine the original great trees were like, perhaps one of each, or each an amalgamation of both. And now we see an abundance of the poplar tree, likely being the trees of the Erdtree. The new blueprint for the One Great. In Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which heavily inspired George R.R. Martin, there are two divine ancient trees, the two trees of Valinor, known as the trees of the Valar, or simply the two trees were Lorelin, the gold tree, and Telperion, the silver tree, which brought light to the lands of Valar in ancient times. They were destroyed by Melkor and the primal spider, but their last flower and fruit were made by the Valar into the sun and moon, much akin to the lower and upper spheres of the Old Age, the kingdom of the sun and the agents of the moon. This to me is also very reminiscent of the trees of life and death. Much like my good friend Jack is a mimic pointed out, there are trees on the cerulean and crimson flasks. I think that these are two different trees, bearing two different fruit. One a flask of vitality or life, and one a flask of mana, or divine knowledge of intelligence, mind, and the divine. We see this iconography of two trees all throughout the lands between. I first heard of this idea of the between two trees iconography when it was brought to my attention by the peerless NamelessSinger. Again, definitely check out their channel. Her hair holds an unfathomable amount of secrets, and she is about to start her great march. We see this between two trees symbolism on the imp statues in catacombs and other locations, and also the Rao ruins. And I've managed to find this between two tree symbolism in a couple of other locations, like out the front of the Grand Lifts, and this inverted version in Elphael. So while there may have been two trees in the equation of the one great, one that had dominion over life, and the other over divine knowledge and death, then perhaps like the story of the two trees from Lord of the Rings, one was a male and one was a female, one bearing fruit and one seed, and they were married in the form of the One Great. The priests of Elphael travelled south, spreading the seed of the One Great, building the catacombs, and eventually the nameless eternal city was established at the base of the first tree after the sacred mountain tops, perhaps as the foothold in this mid-sphere of the lands between, just as Telperion came before Lorelin, if only just. My best guess would be, based on the information presented, that there were two trees, perhaps whose canopies interleaved, who were of the same network and stock. They were an amalgamation of all of the trees, which are all connected to the Greattree network, as shown by the respective resin descriptions. One of these trees was the Tree of Knowledge, whose fruit or seed we can see being consumed by lamprey-like creatures, leading to its transformation, potentially into a bird or a dragon. Both this pine-like fruit or seed and this transformation into a bird symbolizing enlightenment, who then would perhaps spread the seed of the Greattree as we see in real life and mythology. This was the produce of the Tree of Divine Knowledge, something mortals were forbidden from partaking in. The other tree is the Tree of Life, whose fruit was life itself, and from which all life came, essentially soul fruit. In the Bible, this is the tree which Adam and Eve are allowed to eat, the tree which grants long life and youth, even immortality. The tree whose fruit I would give up literally everything just to have a little nibble of.
unlike the Tree of Knowledge, which grants the divine knowledge of good and evil, but also death. The fictional 4th century letter of Alexander to Aristotle tells that Alexander, during his expedition to India, visited a grove with 2 holy trees. Inside the grove, he met a priest of more than 10 feet tall, who explained that one tree was male and could speak the Indian language, and foretold one's future at the rising of the sun. The other tree was female, could speak Greek, and foretold one's future at the rising of the moon. In illustrated copies of this narrative, the oracle trees are sometimes conflated with the dry tree, another tree that Alexander visited, in whose branches he found the phoenix, a legendary self-resurrecting bird, reminiscent of the flaming palmet imagery we see all through the lands between. Vincent of Beauvais stated that the balm of the trees allowed priests at the grove to live for 300 years. The 14th century Polychronion of Ranulph Higden attributed their longevity to the tree's apples. A unique Middle English translation of the Polychronion describes the trees as follows: "The trees of the sun and moon are in India, and by their apples priests live for 500 years." The conflation of the balm and the fruits, both granting blessings of long life and grand stature, seem to be similar in nature to the effects of Erdtree sap, which is in essence a more controlled version or corrected design of this distribution of power, and the fruit of the 2 great trees granting those who imbibe it grand stature, power, and vitality, as we see in Godfrey and his knights, and as I am arguing, as we see in the giants from engorging the fruit of the trees. This new distribution from the Erdtree, not taking shape like the fruit once found all through the lands between, via the Greattree network, but of sap collected and distributed by those in control, to empower and perhaps even control their favoured and most loyal warriors, taking the power from the Greattree network in order to bolster their own forces, literally hoarding power, a much more controlled system. In the age of the 2 trees before this system, people would live, die, their flesh burned away and their spirit guided back to the roots and be reborn once more. Or at least, their essence would once again become life, and the cycle would continue. And this design was the mistake of the greater will, as from life comes death, and from death comes power, and with this divine knowledge, fiery ambition. I would wager certain important clergymen, priests, and ascetics, which are solitary spiritual people, were gifted or partook of the fruit of knowledge, acting as the guardians of this divine truth. And perhaps when the ancient dragons were dealt their critical blow, their king mortally wounded by Baal, with Olympus in turmoil, as if the Titans had sent the gods into disarray, they put in motion a plot to usurp the greater will and use the one great and their divine knowledge of the mechanisms of life and death to ascend to godhood in place of the fled god of the dragons. If the sap of the Erdtree grants the imbiber power and vitality, I imagine the effects of partaking of the fruit of the tree of life would have similar effects. If this is the case, and these priests ate as much fruit as they were able, like a tarnished popping stacks of runes and leveling up, I can imagine their strength, stature, vitality, and power would be unfathomable, godlike even. I think this is reinforced by the fact that man was once much larger, likely having partaken of this fabled fruit and being much larger in general, and became feeble after fighting one another, likely by design, over the age of the Crucible. The Age of the Crucible was done as a 2-part plan, both to empower the Crucible for the Erdtree and enfeeble mankind, as when they were killed and returned to the roots, as the 2 great trees which previously operated and comprised the one great had been destroyed by the Astel sent by the greater will, in my opinion, to stop the fell god. There was no more fruit for their descendants, who in comparison would be smaller, sapped of this once bountiful nutrient, which, after the Erdtree's growth, was distributed only to the champions of the Erdtree in the form of sap, to solidify their supremacy. And so, with the distribution of souls from the Greattree network halted, and the age of the Crucible culling those enriched with the bounty of the fruit, returning their power or souls to the roots, what was borrowed was returned. But that was just the beginning, perhaps, of the sin of the giants. Perhaps the imbibing of the fruit of the Tree of Life was part of the sin, but I think it's what they did with the knowledge that they gained from the fruit of the Tree of Knowledge that was the true transgression. The divine fruit of the original tree, which perhaps they partook of in order to become priests of death in the first place, or as blasphemy after the dragons retreated to Farum Azula. It wasn't just the taking and the eating of the fruit that was the real problem, but instead what they did with the knowledge they gained about the nature of souls, of life, death, and power. Also located between two trees is the Forge of the Giants, which may have existed during the age of the two trees and reign of the dragons, as the heads on it are very reminiscent of dragons. Though I'm not too sure if it's ancient or not, because if we have a look from behind, we notice these fins, which are very similar to the ones seen on drakes. They also have creepy people teeth, like the divine beasts. If it was used during the time of the ancient dragons, it was likely used to craft the protectors of the catacombs, using the knowledge of souls, of life and death. Whether or not it's ancient or non-ancient dragon, I'm not entirely sure, but perhaps the fork-tongued dragon weapon wielded by the imps is an indication, as a fork-tongued dragon to me sounds almost serpentine, like how the drakes seem more biological and reptilian than their ancient dragon counterparts. And these dragons look awfully serpent-like. Or perhaps again it is simply the ancient dragons as they were in the time of their reign, before their features were petrified, and their gold diminished. Whichever it is, it doesn't matter for the point I am making, which is that this giant melting pot of life was the ultimate representation of the giant sin, and was used by the giant priests after the fall of the dragons to craft the civilization of soul slavery, and bring about the Industrial Revolution equivalent in the lands between, and in the process depleting the One Great. On the base of the stone coffins we see a snake eating its own tail. However, if we look a little closer we can see that this snake has two forms. One has a much different looking snout and brow ridge, more dragon-like than the other. And while one seems to have the creepy human teeth that we see on the divine beasts and on the snakes or dragons on the forge, the other has fangs. The Ouroboros is an ancient symbol that depicts a serpent or dragon eating its own tail. The earliest record of Ouroboros was found in the 1600 BC in ancient Egypt. The symbol was used to document the Egyptians' understanding of the sun and was said to represent the travels of the sun disk, as well as the cycle of life and rebirth. And in Farum Azula, I believe this is shown in multiple images, especially the lamprey-like imagery, which I would argue shows the cycle of life coming from a tree and spreading that life, that it is all the same thing. And we see a copy of this iconography in Eni Ilim. This represents rejuvenation and new beginnings, like the tree growth cycle, the continuation of the cycle, and I believe it was the breaking of this cycle that is the essence of the original sin, similar to the linking of the fire or the other options in Dark Souls. It was the breaking of this cycle, the removal of souls from the Greattree network to fuel their own fiery ambition to become gods over life and death, that was their sin. Just like in the tale of Alexander the Great and the giant priests of the two trees, I wager that the priests who consumed the fruit of the tree of life, becoming long-lived and grand, became the giants who began the divine art of smithing, with their divine knowledge from the Tree of Knowledge. It was this knowledge that led to the rise of spirit technology, the smith-script weapons that are imbued with spirits, allowing them to return to the owner when thrown or launched. Their eternal slave labor, the golems, who were powered by spirits, whose weapons don't hold similar to the Rao burrows, spirit-catching instruments used to manipulate the power of spirits, guardians of the burials powered by similar means, with weapons donning similar holes, and imps with representations of all parties involved. It was this knowledge that led to their grandeur, their power, and their fiery ambition, the erecting of grand forges to fuel this new empire based on the foundation of soul manipulation. What I am saying would mean the magma has souls in it, and well, yes, it does. I believe what is in the middle of the Giant's Forge is very likely corpse wax. I think this is heavily hinted at by the fact that the weapon of the Fire Prelate Chief, who beheaded himself in a sacrifice to show his faith, is called the Cranial Vessel, which is a candlestick with what appears to be a mound of corpse wax in the middle that explodes, igniting with fire, giving what I imagine is a clear demonstration of the whole process. We see the result of this in the forges throughout the Shadowlands, watched over by the spirit slave smithing golems, who were likely powered by this red glintstone, which is said to be made through the power of sacrifices, who keep as their pets living magma that is very akin to the Silver Tears, artificial lifeforms whose core is essentially a blank slate soul. Either lifeforms were sacrificed to this forge to become one with the magma, to be imbued with weaponry and technology, or perhaps they felled and used trees which contained souls of the living, as hinted at by the root resin. That's more than likely corpse wax. I do wonder though if they did sacrifice people, if it was the shaman, given the manner of their execution is very reminiscent of the vindictive impaling crusade Marika ordered against the Hornsent, who used her people, the shaman, to try and attain godhood through melting pots of life. After all, we already have proof of concept of this, and the forges being used for burning people and souls, specifically the souls of maidens, like Melina, or Banal's maiden. And the fire giants themselves aren't too shy about sacrificing their own limbs for power. So who initiated all of this? Who has a vast arsenal of divine knowledge, and who is the best contender for being the long-lived, giant head priest of this order, who would become the fell god? There is only one contender, in my eyes. There is only one person that has more statues and depictions of himself throughout the lands between than Marika and Radagon combined, yet who is as nameless and as unmentioned as the fruits of the Greattree. Like his name and accomplishments were wiped from history entirely, cleansed like a stain. There is only one man who is presented embedded in a tree like the gods Marika and Radagon, and who is at the center of all of these locations and civilizations. There is only one man shown on the campaign trail of the Old Order in Liurnia, on these peculiar structures. The four belfries link together three vital locations: the ancient dynastic ruins between the ancient dynastic ruins and Siofra's eternal city, the Chapel of Anticipation, and Farum Azula, one famously unfamous individual, so much so that the community, not the game, had to make a name for him. And I would recommend that name be changed to Felden John. And I believe the one-eye symbolism may very well have started with Felden John, given his statues look as though they are missing an eye. I feel like this is even hinted at even further in the reliefs in Mogwin, which have a red effect going over that very eye. Not only is this man almost entirely depicted as a giant, but he is the man carrying the tablets, the divine knowledge, the words of God, depicted as the known gods are in the sacred tree. These belfries are integral to understanding the links and the story as a whole. They tie together extremely important locations and tell the story of the man depicted on them. Not only do they link together the ancient ruins, Chapel of Anticipation, Farum Azula, and the Eternal Cities, but just as the catacombs and heroes' graves which are adorned in Elphael's symbology share the same jars with the ancient ruins, the belfries which link all of these locations using Eternal City technology also display the skull iconography from Elphael, And on the theme of divinity, the Divine Tower at their center doors, we see the same bodies floating towards the center as we do in the catacombs and heroes' graves. There is also a host of other symbolism linking these locations, but I'm going to spare you for now, as that can and will be explored in the next video. This would mean, in some manner, the death rites of old should have something to do at least with giants, and in addition to the giant coffins we do indeed see the Tibia Mariner summon giants, donning a ring on their wedding finger. I truly do believe the North region, sacred and forbidden, home to an ancient and sacred tree, a powerful people who once ruled the lands, was tremendously important. There are many mythologies which draw striking parallels between the northern sacred snowlands protected by storms and the treasures and knowledge they hold, and the people who reside there. For instance, Hyperborea was a realm of eternal spring located in the far north, beyond the home of the North Wind. Its people were a blessed, long-lived race untouched by war, hard toil, and the ravages of old age and disease. Hyperborea was usually described as a continent-bound land bordering the north by the great, earth-encircling river of Oceanus, and on the south peaks of the legendary Rhipaean Mountains. Its main river was the Eridanos, whose banks were lined with amber weeping poplar trees, and its water home to flocks of white swans. Blessed with eternal spring, the land produced 2 crops of grain per year, but most of the countryside was wild, and covered with beautiful forests, the so-called Garden of Apollon. The southern border of Hyperborea was guarded by the bitterly cold peaks of the impassable Rhipaean Mountains, home of the Boreae, whose chill breath brought winter to the lands of the south. Its peaks were inhabited by gold-guarding griffins, and its valley by the fierce, one-eyed Aramaspoi tribe. Beneath the southern slopes lay Torophorus, a desolate, snow-covered land cursed with eternal winter. Hyperborea was a theocracy ruled by 3 priests of the god Apollon. These giant kings, known as the Boredae, were sons of Boree, the North Wind. Their capital contained a circular temple dedicated to the god where hecatombs, 100 head of asses, were sacrificed in his honor. The people also celebrated their god in an eternal festival of music, song, and dancing. The realm plays a role in several myths. Pantheon tried to drive the chariot of the sun, but lost control and was struck down by Zeus, sending his flaming body plummeting into the Hyperborean river Eridanos. His mourning sisters were afterward transformed into amber-shedding poplar trees on its banks. There are stories that describe Hyperboreans as pilgrim founders of several important Greek shrines. The Delians told a tale of how the pregnant goddess Leto came to the island from Hyperborea, accompanied by a pack of wolves, where she gave birth. On our way to the sacred mausoleums, there is a secret passage linking the forbidden snow wastelands to the sacred fields, which holds the iconography of both of these locations, a secret burial ground leading to the land of the dead, the sacred fields. And these staff-wielding kings, like those in Farum Azula, like those knights and figures in Elphael, guard the way to the sacred fields, where the ancient and tallest boughs rest, devastated, nothing but their carcass remaining, just like the once immense tree at its peaks, of which naught but a stump remains. The system that took over after the fall of these 2 trees was a closed and controlled system, ushering the souls and power back to the roots in the Age of the Crucible and re-establishing the supremacy of the Greater Will over the One Great. Unlike the previous age, where souls were sanctioned to be used to make their priests long-lived, create guardians for the catacombs and spirit summoning as seen in the commanders of the knights of their forces, and the presence of banished knights in their spectral form, the only soul juice leaving this new tree that bore no fruit was the sap. The use of souls and the power for the protection and perpetuation of the system is sanctioned, hallowed, and a duty. However, the use of that knowledge, of souls and power, for one's own fiery ambition, that is the very sin that would corrode the foundations of the One Great. This is why the fire giants are impaled like the Hornsend, who use divine knowledge to commit atrocities,
and do nothing but take from the one great.
Perhaps another hint are the burned 2 fingers on the left hand of the fire giant. As I have mentioned in previous videos regarding meta, and as a subscriber Moss Owns You YouTube reminded me in my post about the fingers, Sinkadia was used to grant intelligence to the beasts by the god of the dragons. And so, if granting fingers grants intelligence or knowledge, and the fire giants are the remnants of these priests whose sin was their use of divine knowledge, then perhaps the removal of fingers symbolizes or results in the removal of intelligence, like some form of lobotomy. Perhaps this is why the fire giant, who was once at the peak of society, has a vocabulary consisting of. But what on earth could burn a fire giant? Is it frostbite from the environment, or ancient Zamor warriors? Was it Mesmer's flame, which can burn even spirits, as shown by the Shadowland denizens? Or perhaps another flame we are all familiar with, one which the monks of the Flame of Ruin fled to, out of fear. Regardless, the presence of a red, glowing, almost runesque or stitching in the wound suggests to me it was specific and intentional, and very similar to the 3 fingers. If we put them side by side, and a shout out to Zullie the Witch for this amazing image of the whole hand, we begin to see that perhaps there was in fact some form of whole hand, or one great, that was fractured. And what better way to display the fractures of the one great, a whole hand broken by this betrayal, than this imagery. Given Meta and the 2 fingers she births are broken, it really does make one wonder about the relationship and what the not broken children of Meta would have looked like. And so, with the age of the Crucible and establishment of the Erdtree, the return of the souls via wars and battles and the prevention of that power being distributed by the fruits of life, and only by sap to chosen champions, what was borrowed was returned. You may have noticed there is quite a lot missing, as I have tried very hard only to tell half of the story, which I will be exploring in the next major video. After all, there is another tree, and there are other ancient lords with skin of stone, who came to life when a meteorite hit long ago, who don patterns hinting at an ancient lineage. And there are other secret lineages, such as the mysterious Knights of Eocade, comprised of warriors and ascetics, whose flying weapons, noting not to mistake their colour for rust, are inscribed with ruins. There are other ancient cities, an ancient civilization who most certainly has a thing or two to do with trees, water, spirits, and the power of life and death, who have the twin bird written all over them, and whose sacred black moon was destroyed in mysterious circumstances, and whose sky was taken away after inspiring the ire of the Greater Will, whose technology links places of untold importance at the belfries and beyond, nestled each time by an ancient ruin, whose influence infects nearly every corner of the lands between, whose lineage is sprinkled throughout the lands between with traces leading back to Elphael, a society of sorcerer priests and royalty. Just like the Sword of Night and Flame, there is a second side to this, and just like the fall of the Fell God, Kingdom of the Sun, and Reign of the Dragons, the fall of these ancient cities is inextricably connected, as causality would have it, as regression demands. And what about the other grand figures who appear in both ancient depictions, ruins, and throughout the lands between? Their untold stories become unraveled by following the clues, the links of lineage hidden in plain sight. And one very important figure. Join me in my next long-form video, where I will explore the other half, and therefore the whole of it. The timeline of the grandmother, lineage of the three sisters.